Welcome to DMV Spotlight on ESPN 630, the sports capital, where we shine a light on local stories from D.C., Maryland, and Virginia to inform, enlighten, and inspire you. I'm Barbara Britt, and my guest this morning is Rachel Felver. Now, if you've lived in this area for any amount of time, you know that the Chesapeake Bay is a local treasure, and there have been ongoing efforts really for decades to protect it. And Rachel Felver is the Director of Communications for the Chesapeake Bay Program and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And I want to thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm very happy to be here, too.
So, obviously, we all love the Bay. We love being in it, swimming in it most of the time when there's not jellyfish, and maybe fishing in it, crabbing, driving over it on the Bay, or going to Sandy Point, or taking boats out, or whatever. But again, we have had really this, I guess it's a battle really to protect the Bay going back how many years now?
Well, I will say a lot of the nonprofits like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation first came up to light in like the late 1960s. The Chesapeake Bay Program, we celebrated our 35th anniversary last December. So we are moving towards 4 decades now of really partnering together through the entire watershed and science and restoration to keep the Bay clean and healthy.
And you see it on the back of the Maryland license plate all the time.
Yes, Protect the Bay is definitely what all of the nonprofits and organizations preach, for sure.
Now, do all of these organizations work together, Rachel?
So the Chesapeake Bay Program, and that's the beauty of the organization I work for, is that we are a partnership. We're a regional partnership for the 6 states throughout the watershed, which are New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and then also the District of Columbia. And we also have partners from the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as what is called the Chesapeake Bay Commission, which is a tri-state legislative body that kind of work on our behalf with the legislators of Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And all of those representatives signed on to what we call the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. And there's been several iterations of that agreement now since 1983 when we were first formed. The most recent one was signed in 2014, and that's what we talk about now today when we look at these indicators of progress to see how the Bay is doing.
So some of this, when we go back in history and we look at it, it was sort of that realization of, wow, we can't have like runoff into the Bay. I mean, there's the old-fashioned, just plain old litter that needs to come out of the Bay, and the dead zones and things like that. So these are things that you have been tracking for all these decades. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of the work that came out of the program, a little before my time, but back in the early 70s when they were really first looking at the health of the Bay, they really attributed a lot of the pollution to be coming from some of the pollution sources like nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And those were the 3 big ones that they decided they really wanted to concentrate on. We still have other issues, obviously, with litter, with different toxic contaminants that we're looking at. But when the Bay Program formed back in 1983, what was really unique is that we just basically all came together to partner kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of like in this umbrella organization that everybody's working together. So for instance, like I work for the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, but my neighbor that sits next to me works for the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, and it's kind of like we all lend a hand into trying to move this progress forward.
All right, so I know that there's a series of reports that come out at different times from some of these different organizations that look at some of the indicators of the
Correct.
Bay overall. So walk us through a couple of those indicators. Sure. And where we are now.
Sure, and one other thing I'll point out that is unique about the Chesapeake Bay Program, and we have several big accomplishments, but one of them is that we were the first organization to put a comprehensive monitoring network in place across the entire watershed to monitor water quality. And also we are the ones that basically put together what we call the Chesapeake Bay model, which is used to predict if all these states put pollution practices in place to reduce them, how is that going to look in 2 years, 5 years down the road in actually reducing that pollution. So that's what we have been responsible for.
And let me back up then
Sure.
for a second, because you mentioned that there are the 6 states and the districts. So Virginia, Maryland, D.C., that all makes sense because, we all touch the Bay. We see the Bay. We're a part of it. You get up to Pennsylvania, they don't have any Bay frontage.
Correct.
And West Virginia, that I can now. My geography is coming into play, and that's not that great. But as far as I know, they don't front the bay in any way, shape, or form. And so, explain to us how the watershed works and how it flows down.
So everybody, no matter where you live, lives in some type of watershed, and that could be the little streams or creeks that run into a river that eventually runs into a larger water body. So I grew up, for instance, 22 miles out of the Chesapeake Bay watershed in Pennsylvania, which is crazy, like you said, because I never saw the bay. But it actually starts all the way up in New York, in Cooperstown, New York, where the Baseball Hall of Fame is, with the Susquehanna River, and that flows all the way down through Pennsylvania and enters the bay in northern Maryland, as most folks know. West Virginia, the Potomac River is a big tributary. That's where the headwaters are of the Potomac. And out in Delaware, same thing. The Nanticoke River is what kind of flows in the bay from there.
So is it difficult then for these states that don't, touch the bay, for a lack of a better term, to get them to say, oh, wow, what I'm doing here really does?
It is absolutely difficult. For instance, the things that we talk about a lot here in DC and Maryland that we care about, how are the crabs doing? How are the oysters? Somebody in Harrisburg State College, New York, they kind of shrug, be like, yeah, that's nice. I like to eat them, but it's not like I could buy them off a truck like you could do out here. But for us, it's all about making those local connections. One thing I'll mention, actions on land really drive water quality. Just last week, one of our partners, the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, put out a report that talks about the land that has been conserved across the watershed, and it's fascinating. And Pennsylvania has actually conserved the most land out of any of the watershed states over the past few years. So we really try to make those local connections for people.
Does that mean like a buffer of land? What does that mean?
It just means any protection of actual like acre of land, things like that. I don't have the exact numbers on me. They're in the report, but it's I can tell you we kind of track that as well with our indicators for conservation of land. And I believe we were at about 1.3 million acres conserved since 2010, the last time I checked.
And the Chesapeake Bay, and I'm going to go back into my high school science now, and that's really scary. But it's an estuary,
yes,
which means
it is basically generally. I think you asked me this last time, and I'm trying to remember what our answer was. It's how salt and fresh water kind of mix that forms an estuary. It's a combination of both for the most part.
And it's really is a filter. Some of that, the grasses, and it helps filter and clean
different things. So the grasses are a big help. The oysters are a big help. All of those different elements work together to keep that area clean.
Because a lot of that area, I mean, depending on where you go in the bay, you have the brackish water, correct, you have the fresh waters coming down, you have the saltier water in the bay itself. Correct. I mean, it's fascinating just in and of itself.
Absolutely. And I can talk before I get into some more actual numbers of progress. One thing we really saw this summer is the impacts from the weather we had last year, and even some of the impacts still carrying on to this summer.
That was a lot of that rain.
Exactly. So last year we had some of the rainiest weather we've seen across much of our watershed over the past how many years. I think DC set records, Pennsylvania set records. So we're really still seeing the impact of a lot of that rain. I will talk in a few minutes, I'm sure, about the blue crabs. But one thing, for instance, is the fresh water that's coming down from the Susquehanna River at the top of the bay has really flown even further more because we had so much of it. So a lot of the animals that really thrive on more of the brackish water, the salt water, are more in the South Bay this summer because same thing with jellyfish, things like that, because it's too fresh for them up north. So that's something we're seeing.
They don't like that water.
Exactly. They want salt.
So I want to go back and ask you, because you said that you have this comprehensive monitoring of the water quality. How do you do? I mean, you see people do that like at a swimming pool. They take their little things and they shake it, and I don't even know what they're doing, but they're doing something smart.
So we have water quality monitoring stations all through the watershed. They are monitored by many different partners. most of the time by the United States Geological Survey, our scientists from that organization, but also from NOAA and EPA. We have little buoys that sit out in the bay that they track, temperature and water quality and the weather and things like that. So you can go to the NOAA website or in the USGS website and actually see those real-time conditions, which are pretty cool. We also work with a lot of citizen monitoring groups, and we have a really cool program that's a partnership between the Chesapeake Bay program and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay called the Citizens Monitoring Cooperative. And so it actually goes out and trains citizen watershed groups and helps provide the information. And some of those results from those monitoring groups actually go and use in our scientific data and analysis now.
That's awesome. So you train people how to gather the information.
Exactly. Yep.
And is it a lot of times to people who live nearby or not necessarily?
We've worked with many different organizations. That program's actually headquartered down in Virginia, but I know they go work with folks in Pennsylvania and Delaware and all over, and they do different kind of tier levels to different levels of data and training them. And it's usually just people that volunteer for their local watershed organization that want to help out.
And are they collecting a sample, or are they?
It could be all different ways. It could be collecting a sample. It could just be going out and putting something in the water to track different levels. So it's a lot of different things that they could do.
That's fascinating. I'm speaking this morning with Rachel Felver. She is the Director of Communications for the Chesapeake Bay Program and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Do I have that right?
It's just Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay.
Just for the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And I want to thank you for being here today and tell us about some of these ways that you look at the bay and the way that you calculate the health of the bay. I know that you pay a lot of attention to the grasses in the bay, the underwater grasses. So tell us, what does that tell us about the bay?
Sure. So I never thought that these grasses would really be so important to the health of the bay, but they really are. They are one of the indicators we have to show that the bay's health is improving, because they could be the easiest one that are impacted by weather, by pollution. I'm sure folks are familiar with the term dead zone when we have a lot of algae in the bay, but they also are help with providing habitat for our bay critters, and they help clean the water. So if we don't see grasses, then we know something's wrong. So we had a very interesting year. We actually, every year we have our scientists from both the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. They do different surveys for bay grasses. They do aerial surveys where they're actually out flying around counting. They're out on boats. And we had their most recent numbers were sent to us just this past July, and we put those out there. And so our bay grasses had a slight decline from last year, but there's a little caveat to that. So last year we had the most acreage we had seen in over 30 years. It broke records. It was over 100,000 acres in the bay. We dropped slightly this year to 91,559 acres. But the issue we had was we had the rain. Last year, we had a little bit more cloudy water because of the rain we hadn't seen before. We also had some security restrictions where we can't fly over around Patuxent Air Base and other areas. So looking at that information from the previous year and what we're seeing this year, we could actually almost estimate that we saw more upwards of 108,000, which would have been the highest ever. And why that's significant is because despite the rain last year, despite everything else, the grasses still survived.
That is exciting news. And the grasses do they live just around the edges of the bay?
You can find the grasses almost anywhere, actually. We are always constantly reminding folks that it's not seaweed. Don't pull them out. They are a good thing. So I actually taught some environmental education campers this summer a little bit, and we were looking out at the marina and there was grasses everywhere, and they kept going, ew, ew. I said, no, this is great. We could probably go in and find crabs in there and everything else. So just kind of keep that mindset. It's a good thing to see those grasses.
That's good. But it is separate from algae that can,
Correct.
Is there algae that can look like a grass?
So the algae, and just because I'm not total scientist expert on this matter, I tend to think a lot of the algae you see more kind of hanging out near the surface. So the grasses are what's growing from the bottom that you'll see.
Okay, so that's a completely different thing in the grasses. So that bay barometer is pretty good then, of the grasses.
Correct, yeah. So
let's talk about some of the others.
Sure.
Obviously the crabs.
We had A great year for blue crabs. It was a 60% increase from the previous year. So we saw 372 million this past year compared to, 372 million 2018. 594 million in 2019. So, and I know there has been a big question of where are the crabs because people are not seeing them as much. And I can explain the same thing I said before is we're seeing a lot of crabs moving south because of the water. The fresh water is more in the north. So we're getting more crabs more down the southern bay, unfortunately, this summer.
So the other question is just similar to how do you measure? Nobody, and I know people are pulling up their little crab pots going, 1, 2.
So it's pretty interesting. So our scientists go out all winter long, if you can imagine, and they do what's called a dredge survey. And that's exactly what they do. They pull up all the crabs and count them.
Wow.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing.
Now, I have to ask this, does it bother the crabs? I mean, they pull them up and then they just send them back down?
Exactly. They pull them up, they count them, throw them back down.
Wow.
Yeah. And I know there's probably some very interesting calculations that go into how exactly they figure that out. So, but that's unfortunately not my wheelhouse. But that I know in Maryland, it's the Maryland Department of Natural Resources that do that every year.
That is amazing that they're out there all that. Well, that's good for us, right? That we have fabulous crabs. And then obviously that the impact there is not just the bay, although that's certainly enough reason, but how much of the impact then on the economy as well.
Exactly. Yeah, we just always like to remember that, this clean water leads to a very vibrant economy because you have increased tourism, the recreation, the blue crabs, the fishing, all those things, they play a huge part.
We also have the oysters.
Yes. So the big thing that I will talk about for oysters this year is in our Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, which I mentioned earlier, is that we commit to restoring 10 tributaries by 2025 for oyster restoration.
And when you say that, what does that mean?
Yep. So that is restoring large-scale oyster reefs. So that's going out there with all sorts of materials, putting it out there, planting spat or baby oysters so they can eventually work to filter the water, clean the water. So this is not just, like folks can go and do like Maryland Grows Oysters or go through the Chesapeake Bay Foundation for their oyster program and plant them in their homes. This is billions upon billions of oysters that are being planted out in waterways.
That's amazing. Where did the baby oysters come from? I mean, I'm not to be...
No, actually a lot of them are grown in laboratories. The University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science in Horn Point over in Cambridge, they grow baby oysters there. So that's where a lot of the spat comes from. They plant even larger adult oysters that end up laying eggs, and that's where a lot of that comes from in the materials.
So they put, I mean, I've seen news reports at different times. Do they put like a piece of concrete or a reef or some kind of structure in the water? Okay,
they do. They put this. So the structures there are many different materials that are all environmentally friendly and not going to harm the bay that are put out there. They're all different types, and then the oysters are planted on top of that material.
And then is there usually like a navigation, something, stay away baby oysters, or does it just become part of the ecosystem?
I believe it just becomes part of the ecosystem. I've never personally been out there to look at some of the ones that are more complete, but so I don't know, but I do know the whole goal is eventually this is part of the bay. This is kind of coming back to what it was. So
then the goal is to put them in these different tributaries. And how long have they been working on this?
So it's been going on for several years. One thing I'll mention, so both Maryland and Virginia have what we're calling a complete tributary restoration. So in Virginia, it is down, I'm going to make sure I get this right, in the Lafayette River, and in Maryland, it's out in Harris Creek. And so the one thing that I think really needs to be spoken, the Harris Creek oyster restoration is not just the largest in this area or this country, it's the largest in the entire world. And it's just the fact that we're working that much to clean up the bay.
That is amazing.
Yeah, it's really an amazing accomplishment. And it's so many partners that came together to make sure that happened. It wasn't just one entity. It was nonprofits. It was state governments. So it was really great.
Well, let me go back and ask you about that, because the fact that you do get, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, D.C., West Virginia, I'm forgetting somebody now. Delaware, of course. To all work together. That's a tremendous accomplishment in and of itself.
Exactly.
We don't always have that in other arenas.
Yeah. Well, and, we try to really, the Chesapeake Bay program, we feel like a lot of times is not necessarily as recognized as some of the other entities out there. But these are our accomplishments, and I mean, they're really ones that should be celebrated because they're a pretty big deal.
And is it done on the state level? I know they just had the Chesapeake Executive Council meeting. Do you work with them as well?
Yes, I work very closely. That is my one duty is to plan that meeting every year. So I am very involved. So yes.
Well done. So that's really the leaders, the governors.
Correct. So our Chesapeake Executive Council is made up of the governors of those 6 states I mentioned, the mayor of D.C., the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, who represents the federal government.
So when they all get together, do you help them create the agenda ahead of time? Yep. How does that work?
We have a planning committee from representatives from every one of those entities, and I kind of am the lead herder, shall we say, of everyone. But we work for months ahead of time to put together the agenda and find speakers and kind of make sure the day goes smoothly.
And again, sometimes when you get that many leaders in one area, it may be difficult to find agreement. Where are the areas where they agree, and where are the areas where there may be not agreement or there a perception of non-agreement?
So the areas of agreement is that everybody is recommitting to their goals of wanting a healthy and clean bay. I mean, there's no argument on that, and folks really want to work hard to achieve that. One thing I mentioned the theme kind of this year's meeting and what we kind of centered a lot of things were, and this is going to sound technical, but I will explain it, is the submission of what are called the final phase 3 watershed implementation plans. And I'm going to explain what that is. So as most folks know, most of the states in this watershed are asked to reduce the pollution flowing into the bay by a certain amount by 2025. That's something we've been working to. And a lot of every one of these states just recently put together these plans, which kind of is sort of just a strategy saying, this is how we're going to go ahead and reduce this pollution. And so they were literally just submitted about 2 weeks before this meeting. So we kind of want to focus on, all right, these are in place now. We want to look to the future. So this is the time really for folks to kind of commit. We're doing these things. We have issues that we still need to focus on. A lot of places where our pollution is still coming from stormwater, agriculture, that we really need to kind of focus. So there's a lot of discussion on how different states are going to make that happen, because a lot of them have some funding shortfalls. It's a lot of work on the ground for those things to be achieved. And
I was going to ask you that, because obviously within each state there's a lot of competition for those dollars, and then sometimes there's also stakeholders who may, as you said, everybody wants a healthy bay because everybody wins with that, but just the way that happens,
exactly, yeah.
Where you have farmers saying, I've got to grow my food here because this is how I make my living and this is how we all eat. How do you then make that a reality so that they can actually help achieve that goal without doing themselves in?
Well, that's our biggest struggle. And I'm going to say, and I don't know if we've had the best answer to how to achieve that yet. Like you mentioned earlier, a lot of the headwater states, we call them, they don't see that connection to the bay. So going in to tell some of the folks in their agricultural committee, you need to spend money to put in all these practices to clean the bay, they're going to look at you and say, why? I don't see the bay. So we have really been working on the ground up there through different watershed organizations, local governments, really to spread the message again that it's not just about the bay, it's about your water quality. It's the water you're drinking in your backyard, and don't you want that to be clean as well? So it takes a lot of people. So
I know that Maryland Governor Hogan had been the chair this year?
Correct.
Okay. And then there has been over the years just some, I guess the way to say it, maybe some tensions with some of these headwater states. Particularly I'm thinking of Pennsylvania, although I know they have said, look, we are doing what we can. It just may not be on the timetable that other states who are closer to the bay have wanted.
Correct. And I don't really have a huge comment on that. I know I can tell you personally, I've seen Pennsylvania's process over the last couple of years. I do know that they have worked extraordinarily hard, and it's not something that they're just ignoring willy-nilly. Some folks think that they're not doing anything. I know they are. So I do think there's things that have to come to resolution. At some point, Maryland and Pennsylvania got along wonderfully at the meeting. There was no drama that I could see. So just fingers crossed for the future.
So let's go back and make it practical then. So for the farmers, let's just say you're a farmer in Montgomery County. and there's still a few. What can they do?
Sure.
To say, okay, I wanna maybe have a buffer around my farm. I mean, what are the ways that they can do that?
Sure. So there's a ton of different what we call conservation practices of things that they can put into their farm, or even private landowners, things that we really have been focused on that we know need to move forward that helps. There's simple practices that are not as expensive as some others, but are really helpful. One is just planting those buffers around a stream. Like you said, planting trees goes so far. And that's something we are not really succeeding at right now. And we really need to be doing more of that. Another practice is converting perhaps maybe a field that's not in use anymore to a wetland. Just creating a wetland, bringing it back to that natural state is a huge advantage. You could even do something so simple as just putting a fence around your stream so your agricultural animals, cows, whatever, don't walk in there. That's huge. It's to keep the pollution out of the water. So I would encourage them. There's lots of great programs through USDA where farmers can get money to do these practices. So I would say look into that. Contact your local nonprofits for the rivers that you live nearby, and they can help as well.
So then also for our folks who live in more suburban areas,
yes,
all the way to the urban areas, what are practical daily things
sure,
that we can do? Because we love the bay. It's beautiful. We love to see it. We love to look at it. We love to eat out of it. Some people swim in it when there's no jellyfish.
Yeah. Well, stormwater, sadly, is the fastest growing source of pollution to the bay. And a lot of that reason is because of impervious surfaces, development, things like that. And if it's not kind of put in properly with consideration, then you have water just rolling off a pavement and things like that.
And a lot of times I know that when there is a large development, they are required to make a stormwater management
Correct.
Pond, or they're required to have a certain amount of surface that can absorb some of that runoff. Is that actually happening?
It happens sometimes. I'm not as up to speed on the different regulations, and usually that's a locality by locality stipulation. Green infrastructure is becoming huge in different cities across the watershed. I know, for instance, one of my colleagues down in our Virginia office recently worked at a middle school to put in a rain garden and really got the students involved and things like that. So we're seeing those innovative uses of green infrastructure, which is really great.
What is a rain garden?
So a rain garden is just the way you can plant native plants from your area, and it's just the way that it has been planted to collect rainwater. So it's not running off. It's more collecting it into the ground. So it's the rain gardens, rain barrels to collect rainwater. I mean, those are a little bit more, you can definitely go ahead and do all those practices. Some organizations even give rain barrels away for free. A little bit more simple, recycle, don't litter, conserve your energy, you can turn off your lights. I mean, all those kind of simple practices. And on our website, chesapeakebay.net, we actually have a whole list of simple tips that you can do at home.
That's fantastic, because I'm not sure, even as you said, if you live in a city or even in a suburban area, you're still not seeing the bay
Correct.
on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, this doesn't make an impact, but
Yeah.
it truly does.
It does. And I'll say the same thing in an urban area. Plant trees. Trees are so amazing. I mean, they have even been known to put to lower the temperature in a city, which we all know from the sweltering summer is a huge help.
And you do see that more now. You see that on the rooftops. You see
Yes.
rooftop gardens. You'll see people with the massive planters up there. Then their trees are happy up there.
Yes. Yeah, they're growing.
They're growing and they're getting what they need. And so your organization, the Chesapeake, the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, gets funding from...
So the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay is a nonprofit organization, and we actually support the Chesapeake Bay program. So it's a little, I'm kind of like, I'm a grantee to the Bay program, but the Bay program is primarily funded by the Environmental Protection Agency, but we turn around typically and give about 2/3 of our funding away to our state partners and to through different grant programs.
So you really take some of the federal money and then funnel it to other places.
Most of it, actually, yeah.
That's wonderful. I want to thank my guest this morning on DMV Spotlight, Rachel Felvers, Director of Communications for the Chesapeake Bay Program and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And I just want to give the website where people can get some more information if they want to find some of these tips or just get just details into other organizations that are helping. What's the best way that they can do that?
Sure. I would recommend coming to our website, www.chesapeakebay.net, and you can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on DMV Spotlight on ESPN, the sports capital. Check us out online on ESPN 630. I'm Barbara Britt.